Stephen. Thanks so much for having me, and thanks everybody for joining today. Yes, so as Stephen mentioned, I am a director and a fiduciary specialist at Old Mutual Wealth, and I head up the fiduciary business unit. Let's start at the beginning. I suppose what is the crucial question when you meet with your financial advisor, whether you start thinking about your succession planning, your estate planning going forward? The first thing is, do you have a will? So yes, I don't believe that you could do financial planning unless you've done estate planning, and there's a will in place that will dictate as to what happens to your assets after your death. I am keeping this pretty sort of conversational. I don't have a slide presentation or anything, but yeah. So, will, first thing, okay. My brief today is to sort of focus on the foreign aspects relating to investors having foreign assets. In various countries around the world, including the US and UK and Europe. So my sort of very kind of, I suppose, opinionated view, if you like, is about transparency and disclosure. When you're having a discussion with your financial advisor or a fiduciary specialist, estate planner, or whatever, the first thing the first question that I would ask is, do you have foreign assets? Secondly, have those foreign assets been disclosed? As all of you probably know, in the early 2000s, we all had the opportunity to come clean, and any assets that had been transferred out of the country prior to that, we had the opportunity to disclose those to the Reserve Bank and to SARS, pay penalties and back taxes, etc., etc. So the days of not being transparent and open, and the days of non-disclosure of foreign assets, I'm afraid, are over. It's extremely important that you advise your fiduciary specialist or your advisor where you have foreign assets and what those foreign assets are. Just to give you an example, in the process of dealing with an estate, and actually it's the estate, unfortunately, of an advisor, a financial advisor, a very successful financial advisor who had assets in the US, an offshore trust in the Channel Islands, as well as property in Greece. And for whatever reason, he decided that amnesty wasn't a good idea. And I can tell you that we are 3 years down the line and we are nowhere close to finalizing his estate. So despite the delays, the costs, etc., we now have to bring in a voluntary disclosure program, which costs an absolute fortune and can take up to, some of them have taken, that I've dealt with previously, between 3 to 6 years to finalize. So when I talk about transparency and disclosure, it really is a serious topic. There's just no hiding anymore from anyone, whether it's the Reserve Bank, whether it's SARS, whether, with common reporting standards, etc. It actually just causes problems, delays, etc. So yeah, those are the two things. Do you have a will? Do you have foreign assets? Have you disclosed those foreign assets? The next question is, what are the nature of those foreign assets? Do you own properties, immovable properties in any other country in the world? Or is it just a bank account in the UK that you might have, or a share portfolio, a global share portfolio that's managed by one of the financial institutions? So the nature of the asset is also extremely important, and that will dictate as to whether it is necessary to have one will in South Africa that covers your worldwide assets, or whether it's going to be necessary to have a foreign will that deals with that specific asset. So just to be clear on that, I mean, everybody's situation is obviously going to be different. So if I have to give a general view, and I sort of hesitate to be kind of very black and white about this, but generally, if you own an immovable property anywhere in the world, and let's just talk about Portugal, for example, maybe a lot of you know about the Golden Visa program, where if you buy a property in Portugal, you are able, within a certain number of years and spending limited amount of time in the country, you are able to eventually obtain your EU citizenship through the Golden Visa program. In that instance, I would strongly recommend that you have a foreign will, a will that's drafted in Portugal by an expert in estate planning, will drafting in Portugal, because in Europe, in many of the European countries, there are what they call forced laws of succession, which means that you aren't free to leave your assets to whoever you choose. In South Africa, we have freedom of testation. So, if you have a South African will with just South African assets, and you're a South African citizen, you can leave your entire estate to the SPCA if that's your choice. But in the majority of European countries, there is no freedom of testation. So you need to make sure that if you do have, for example, assets in those countries, and particularly, as I say, immovable properties in those countries, that you don't get caught up in a situation where the assets end up with relatives that you might not necessarily have chosen if you hadn't done your homework and discussed a foreign will in that country with a specific specialist. So that's one thing. Generally, and this is, as I say, general statements are often dangerous, but generally a will executed in South Africa that deals with your worldwide assets, excluding immovable property, as I said, is sufficient. In certain countries, our South African letters of executorship are not recognized. So, for example, in the US and the UK, South African letters of executorship are not recognized. So if you have a UK bank account, for example, what the South African executor needs to do is to apply for what we call a grant of probate in the UK, which gives the South African executor the power to deal with that foreign asset, that bank account, that share portfolio, perhaps a unit trust, that a UK unit trust, and similarly in the US. While a probate application does delay an estate and can cost a significant amount of money, what I'm trying to say is that, it's not the end of the world if you don't have a will in the UK, if you just have a foreign bank account, or you have a foreign bank account, a bank account in the UK or in the US. So there are ways around just having one will that deals with your worldwide assets through this probate application process. But as I say, there are delays, there can be delays, and obviously the costs of going through that application can be excessive. But we do have specialists that we work with in the US and in the UK that assist us in these kind of situations. So as I say, the nature of the asset is key, as is the situation of the asset, or the jurisdiction where the asset is situated is key. But once again, disclosure and transparency for me is the most important aspect to consider. Another interesting sort of issue is if you do choose to have a worldwide will, we've taken sort of a policy view that we don't draft wills in Afrikaans anymore. Previously, a lot of advisors, clients would come to us and would prefer to have their will drafted in Afrikaans, but I suppose it's easy to imagine that if you have a bank account in the UK and you need to apply for probate, what's going to happen is that your Afrikaans will is going to be undecipherable by whoever receives it on the other side. So then you start getting into issues around translations of wills and then the costs involved with that. So So, you need to think carefully about whether your will is drafted in English or Afrikaans. So we generally only recommend that our wills are now drafted in English because, as a universal language, it's much easier for the specialists in other countries to deal with an English drafted or a will drafted in English in South Africa than an Afrikaans will. And obviously costs and delays are another issue. Another sort of anecdotal story, I suppose, is going back to the freedom of testation that we have here, and the freedom of testation that doesn't exist in foreign countries. For example, as I said, in Europe, I once dealt with an estate in Austria, of an Austrian woman. She was of Austrian citizenship, but was a permanent resident in South Africa, had a worldwide will in South Africa, and it actually took 12 years to finalize because of the forced laws of heirship in Austria. There were litigation attorneys got involved because her parents and her siblings laid claim to certain assets that she had in South Africa because they were relying on the forced laws of heirship in Austria. So there are lots of things to consider when you sit down and discuss your will with your financial advisor, and obviously eventually the fiduciary specialist that he or she might refer you to. I'm trying to think. So the other issue is situs tax. So as soon as you have assets, for example, in the US, and situs tax is basically the same as estate duty in South Africa. In South Africa, we pay estate duty at 20% of the dutiable value of the estate, up to 30 million rand, and then it goes up to 25% if your estate is worth more than 30 million rand. In the US and in the UK, the estate duty, or situs tax as they call it, is 40%, and the exemptions in the US are $60,000, and in the UK £350,000. So, for example, if you had a bank account in the US and you had more than $60,000 in that bank account, the amount above $60,000 would be taxed from an estate duty or situs tax point of view at 40%, and the foreign revenue authorities have the first claim on that on the estate duty. So you would need to pay estate duty to the US on the amount, as I say, above $60,000, and then claim a credit for whatever estate duty you paid in South Africa. And similarly in the UK, if your assets are worth more than £350,000, the estate duty or situs tax is also 40%. So your executor in South Africa dealing with your worldwide will, the first thing that needs to be paid is the estate duty in the UK to the UK tax authorities, and then whatever what you've paid there, you'll be able to claim back from SARS, obviously, from a credit perspective. So that's another very important issue that you need to consider. As Stephen did say, as we diversify as investors because of the changing sort of environment that we live in, the fact that families are beginning to be spread all over the world and living in different countries, parents in South Africa, children in Europe, the UK or the US, intergenerational estate planning, taking into account the fact that you have heirs that might not be resident in South Africa, is also paramount. So it's extremely important that when you sit down, as I say, with your advisor or your fiduciary specialist, that all of those things are taken into account. So, maybe 30, 40 years ago, a matriarch or patriarch would sit down and do his or her will, and it would be a pretty simple process. And but nowadays, given sort of the global environment that we live in, and the fact that we've all of our clients have diversified into foreign assets, the issue of whether one worldwide will executed in South Africa is going to be sufficient to deal with your assets that are spread, across the globe. And as I say, it's going to be dependent on the nature of the asset and the jurisdiction in which that asset is situated. And I can tell you that, sure, as Stephen mentioned, I've been doing this, or been involved in the fiduciary business for 25 years. I think today is my actual 25th anniversary. Is that the delays and the complexities that are involved when there isn't transparency, there isn't disclosure, you haven't disclosed your foreign assets, you haven't sat down with a fiduciary specialist or your advisor and your fiduciary specialist and gone through your entire estate and not try to sort of not disclose an asset here or there or whatever, it just causes untold grief and anxiety and anguish for your heirs that are left behind. And obviously they're dealing with the grief of losing, whether it's a parent, a spouse, whoever the relative might be, that's always going to be paramount, that there's going to be an emotional response to a death in the family. But to add a further sort of frustration or further anxiety around the death of a relative is the fact that if your affairs are not in order, taking into account where your assets are situated and whether you have considered whether a worldwide will or 2 wills or 3 wills maybe is more appropriate, just adds another layer of as I say, delay, grief, anxiety, etc. So it's heartbreaking actually to deal with estates where you have these kind of issues. So if I can sort of just end off and say that again, transparency, disclosure, sitting down with a specialist. Please don't go to CNA and buy an off-the-shelf will or whatever. Do it properly. I think your last will and testament is probably one of the most important documents that you'll sign during your lifetime, because it's going to dictate, what happens to the wealth that you've created during your lifetime. Is it going to go to the people that you want it to go to? Or is it going to, for example, you land up dying without a will, dying interstate, and then it devolves according to the laws of interstate succession. So you have no control over that. If you die with minor children and you haven't indicated who the guardians in your of those minor children should be, should you and your husband both pass away, or prior to your children attaining the age of majority, that money will land up at the master's office in the guardian's fund. I don't know if any of you have had the misfortune of dealing with the master's office recently, but even a simple estate can now take up to 2 years to finalize, because there have been issues around COVID. The service is just not great, and as I say, it's just all of these factors that lead to more anguish and anxiety to your family members that are left behind. So if I can end off by saying, take it seriously, make sure you have a will first and foremost, speak to a specialist, and we'll take it from there. Is it fine to have 1 will, or do we need 2 or 3, as I've said before? I think, as I said, probably one of the most important documents that you're going to sign. I'm happy to answer any questions, but as I've said to Stephen, it's quite difficult to answer questions because they're probably quite personal to your particular circumstances. So if anyone wants to pop something into the question and answers, I'm very happy to answer, whether by email or on a Teams call, telephone call, whatever. I'm happy to give advice, just to make sure that when the inevitable does happen, yes, and we are not immortal, as we like to think. That things do run smoothly, because it's the people that are left behind that are left with the problems, and your poor executor that you've nominated that has to navigate the complexities around an estate that hasn't been properly dealt with. I think that's pretty much all I have to say, Stephen. I don't know if you have any questions that you want to ask me. I'm happy to answer sort of general questions around this issue.
Great, thanks, Mandy. So I think the first one is more just kind of a comment or an observation. Quite often, as financial planners, when we have these discussions with clients who potentially have properties or larger bank accounts or even investments offshore, their comment is, well, if SARS and the government they don't know about it, so nobody has to know about it. Maybe you could just quickly talk about common reporting and actually how they do know about it. And this is a checkmate.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, with common reporting standards, it's going to be very difficult to conceal foreign assets going forward, and for example, if I was appointed as an executor of an estate and the family of the deceased said to me, well, I do know that my dad had a bank account in the US, but don't worry, I've got signing powers, I can deal with it. Unfortunately, I have a professional responsibility or an obligation to report it and to include it into the estate from an estate duty perspective, because obviously those foreign assets are assets and are subject to estate duty in South Africa, as well as in the country that they're situated. So if you're going to appoint a professional executor to deal with your estate, he or she or me, whoever it might be, has a legal obligation to report that. So, I mean, that it's just no go. I mean, that's just a non-starter for me.
Absolutely.
I wouldn't touch it. I wouldn't touch an estate where somebody asked me not to disclose a foreign asset, for example.
I mean, look, I think quite often, my comment to clients like that is, you can go into the forest and you can shoot somebody, and if nobody sees you, you might get away with it. But, one day in 100 years down the line, with advancements of DNA, they might be able to nab you for that. And what happens, what I'm seeing around like the complexities around the administration of deceased estates are things like that. They're coming to bite you later in life. So I was wanting to know where the source of this money was. You're talking about posthumous BDP processes. And quite often, dealing with some of my older clients, the sort of patriarchs and matriarchs, they had very poor record keeping. And, to try to do this posthumously, to try to figure out where this came from is a nightmare. And the implication of that is, I mean, you look in a local estate, it's already, we already have, experiencing delays by the master to now sort of work through the myriad of these complexities, have far-reaching consequences. And just creating liquidity for the spouse. There might be a share portfolio or a money market that the estate or the client thinks that their spouse has access to, but the reality is they don't until these estates are wound up. Exactly. And just maybe another one or two comments just around translation of wills. I mean, I've seen clients with Portuguese properties, for the gold visas, them having to have their wills drafted in Portuguese, and done, sort of done by a notary over there. So those are some sort of complexities. But just lastly, just thinking about, the investment world, are there things that the South African investor, talk about buying shares, are there things that they can do to avoid international inheritance tax if they have a global share portfolio?
It's very difficult to avoid tax, as you know, and evading taxes. Yes. Yes, evading taxes is a criminal offence. So, but I mean, there are things like wrappers, where your estate duty liability might be decreased. You've got capital gains tax advantages. Nominated beneficiaries within wrappers mean that the transfer of assets from the deceased to the nominated beneficiary is a much easier process, smoother, no delays, etc. So yes, there are products out there that will simplify the administration process. But just to go back to your question or your comments around VDPs and, matriarchs, patriarchs not being around to explain source of funds, etc. The problem with that is, that SARS or the Reserve Bank are going to take the hardest line and probably choose the most punitive kind of or choose the most punitive route to go, which will end up in the estate losing, huge amounts of money in taxes and penalties, etc., because you don't have the records, because, the person or the deceased was hiding the fact that they had these foreign assets and hadn't disclosed them when the opportunity arose, when amnesty was, was available to them in the early 2000s, as I said before. It's just not worth it. It really is not worth it for everybody involved, from a time perspective, a stress, anxiety perspective. It's just, and then, as you say, liquidity, what happens to your family, who has no access to funds because they are stuck in an estate that's taking a number of years to wind up because you weren't upfront and open about, where your assets were. So as I've said, disclosure, transparency is just key. It really is. That's the bottom line.
Oh, thank you very much, man.